I'm pretty sure that most of you have heard or read the story of A Course in Miracles and quite familiar with the details of how it was scribed over a period of 7 years, beginning in 1965. If not, there are a few versions around. A short and snappy version, Journey Without Distance by Robert Skutch, and an in-depth Absence from Felicity by Kenneth Wapnick. There's also a feature-length film available on videotape called, appropriately, The Story of A Course in Miracles. You can get those from the website of the Foundation for Inner Peace if you're interested, bookstores perhaps, or another organization you know who supplies them. So my purpose today is not to review this material already presented so well in other forms, but rather to tell you of my own personal experiences with the scribes, Helen and Bill. And I hope I can bring them even more alive for those of you who are interested. We go back to the early days for me. I call it my real birthday, May 29th, 1975, when I was invited to go with my friend Dr. Douglas Dean up to Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons in New York City to have lunch with two eminent professors of psychology there. I hadn't met them. I had no idea why we were going, except Douglas had been invited and was told to bring me too. Douglas had briefly met Bill Thetford the week before at a conference which I had arranged for a group of doctors and scientists and which I was hosting. And it was held at the New York Academy of Medicine, so I guess all of that was prestigious enough for Bill to be curious and to show up. He had shown up, though, only long enough to ask Professor Dean to come to meet with him and his associate, Dr. Helen Schuckman, at Columbia University the following week, and to bring me along. I was so busy in that crowded auditorium, I never did see the stranger. But little did I know that this day would completely change the rest of my life, and immediately at that. At that time in my life, I was feeling a sense of alienation from myself, from the world. Although I was engaged in a really exciting professional life, teaching at New York University, lecturing, TV appearances, radio and travel, didn't matter. For some reason, I just didn't feel fulfilled. I was fortunate to have a personal life full of people I loved, family, parents, children, friends, but I still felt strangely lonely. And I felt guilty that I didn't have the right or the reason to be in such a state of mind. And finally, alone one night in my apartment, I came undone. I crashed, and I burst into uncontrollable tears, reciting an impassioned plea over and over again. I had no idea where it was coming from except the very depths of my being, and I was crying, "Won't someone up there please help me?" On this date, May 29th, with all this in mind, Douglas and I drove uptown in New York City from my apartment to Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons. We went to the Black Building, which was on 165th Street. Those of you who are New Yorkers, you know where that is. It was rainy, and I had trouble parking my car, and I was really worried we were going to be late. As we rushed down the busy New York City street towards the steps of the building we were to enter in order to go in and meet Dr. William Thetford in the faculty dining room, many people were hurrying to and fro. And yet there on the steps outside the Black Building, I recognized a familiar sight. A tall, lean, handsome man seemed to be waiting peacefully in the middle of a crowd of swarming people. I grabbed Douglas's arm and I said, look, there he is." Douglas was amazed. "Why, Judy, you're right. But he's supposed to wait for us inside in the faculty dining room. I wonder what he's doing outside in the rain." "But wait a second, Judy. You've never seen him before, so how do you know it's Bill?" And that was how I met an ancient partner, Dr. William Thetford. Was I surprised to feel that we'd known each other forever? From the very beginning, having recognized the presence of Bill as if I had known him through oh, let's just venture many lives, it was very easy to accept him totally, without judgment, and with nothing but pure delight. I have no other explanation for the fact that I wouldn't want to change him one iota. I don't mean he was a perfect person. Far from it. He was given to a hidden elitism, often having strong judgments about the intelligence of some people he met. He constantly made terrible, groaning puns. We used to scream at him to stop. He was secretive about his personal life, and he was being treated for depression. In other words, he didn't seem to be a bundle of laughs. But my first take on Bill was he had the look in his eyes of a trapped monk. His eyes darted about often and gave me the feeling that he was asking, "What am I doing here?" I later told him this first impression, and he laughed and he said, "I knew you knew." Back to the story. We followed Bill through hospital corridors and into the faculty dining room, where a very short, conservatively dressed older woman was already sitting at the table. Helen at that point, by the way, was 65, and Bill was 14 years younger, so he was 51. I was 44, and by the way, Ken Wapnick was 33, so there you have it. 33, 44, 51, and 65. I looked at this woman who was sitting there waiting for us, and I had the feeling that I had just better be on my best behavior because this lady had a sharp eye. And Bill introduced Douglas and me to Dr. Helen Schuckman. During the lunch, both professors told us that they had a brief scientific sort of document that they wanted to show Douglas, who happened to be a professor of engineering in Newark, New Jersey. It was a description and a diagram, if I remember, which used sound as a diagnostic tool. They felt it might be interesting to a person with Douglas's background. So that was the reason we were there, I thought, as I could see no possible other reason for these two eminent scientists to want to meet me. My field of study could not possibly have interested them, I thought, as I delved into things that go bump in the night, like parapsychology, psychic functioning, healing, and ESP. I'm sure they didn't want to hear about that. But before they could tell us more about the scientific document they wanted Douglas to read, I heard myself interrupting without thinking. I wasn't even aware I had the thought, but I turned to Helen and I said, "So you're hearing an inner voice, are you?" She turned white and reached out for Bill, who held her hand and urged Helen, "I think we need to tell them." He motioned us out of the dining room, upstairs into their private offices. Kenneth Wapnick was there, and he introduced us to him. Kenneth worked with Helen and Bill at that time. They closed the door, they pulled down the shade, and they recounted their long and fascinating journey scribing A Course in Miracles. And it was a long story, and it was fascinating. This is not the story I'm going to tell you, because as I mentioned before, you can find that told very well in other forms. But I do want to recount the ways in which these two professors of psychology became my teachers for the rest of their lives. Where to pick up the many memories that crowd my mind as I try to select a few choice stories that illustrate the depth of the level these two people knew and understood the Course and how they taught it to me. One night, I had a deeply disturbing dream. It was sharp and memorable, and I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. During the next afternoon with Helen, I told her the dream, and this is what it was. I dreamt I was not a body, but a tiny speck of consciousness drifting in a vast sea of forever. There was nothing to see, no place to go, just awareness of being. And it was quite peaceful. All of a sudden, I felt a magnetic pull tugging at me, and I was chagrined to notice that in the far distance I could perceive something big, black, ugly, and threatening. I tried to change direction, but could not. I was on a straight track towards the object and helpless to break the pull. As I came closer, I realized it was, don't laugh now, a big ebony salad bowl. Well, of course, it doesn't sound frightening now, but this was in the middle of the night, and it was a dream. I was still trembling at the thought as I recounted this dream to Helen. Suddenly, I perceived myself suspended above it, and I didn't know what to do. I kept my figurative eyes as a speck of consciousness closed and was just shaking. Finally, I felt impelled to open my eyes and look down into that ugly, horrendous, ebony salad bowl, but it wasn't black at all. It was glistening, clear acrylic purple, with beautiful rays of light emanating from it. I stared in wonder, and the fear subsided. Obviously, I couldn't shake this dream nor explain it to myself. When I finished telling the story, quite out of breath, she smiled, and she took my hand, and she patted it as if I were a tiny child. "Oh, kitten," she exclaimed, "don't you see? The dark, bottomless, ebony black bowl was your guilt. You faced it, and you recognized it was nothing." A dream in the abstract, a gentle nudge from my teacher to interpret. Changing one's mind about threat, about fear. What a lesson in forgiveness that was. A shift in perception. Re-perceiving fear and watching it turn into love. It was a miracle, and miracles are natural signs of forgiveness. On a lighter note, Bill always kept us supplied with humor and antics to amaze us. Bill had developed a selective listening to resolve what seemed like insurmountable problems. He loved opera, particularly anything by Mozart and Wagner's The Ring trilogy. Bill would never get tickets in advance. He'd decide on the same day that he was in the mood to attend. However, Bill had favorite seats. They had to be in the orchestra, preferably 4th or 5th or 6th rows, but on the aisle. His long legs and his great consumption of coffee made it imperative for him to have as quick an exit as possible. So he would announce to us, "Tonight, I'll go to hear the Magic Flute. Do you have tickets?" one would ask. "Oh, no, but I will. I'll go tonight at 7:30. Then he'd take himself to the Metropolitan box office right after it opened and wait until his selective listening told him, "Now." And he'd go up to the box office and request 2 on the aisle, preferably between the 4th and the 6th row. Sure enough, some subscriber had turned in a pair as they couldn't be used that night, and Bill would smile, and it was opera time. The closest he ever came to not getting return tickets was the time I was with him. I was a bit skeptical, I must admit, not about this working, but about it working every time. So I went with him at the designated time, and I stood on line with him while he requested seats for that evening's performance. Nope, none available. Too bad. No one had turned a seat in. I felt devastated for him. Not Bill. He cocked his head to one side as if re-listening and did not move from his place. And there was a line waiting behind him. When the ticket seller narrowed his eyes at Bill, nudging in a loud voice, "Next," Bill still didn't move. Even as the annoyed attendant was beginning to say something like, "Really, sir, you must move away," the telephone rang right by his elbow. The box office person answered it, and with a look of incredulity, he hung up and he turned to Bill. He fished around in his desk and he pulled out a pass. "You're lucky, buddy," he said. "One of our regulars called and said his plane had just landed. He wouldn't be able to get here in time. You can have his tickets." Bill smiled gratefully and with a little wink at me said, "Well, now." That was Bill's equivalent of gotcha. Miracles are natural. When they do not occur, something has gone wrong. Bill lived by that. He expected it all the time. He knew that he had to be in the right state of mind, though, or nothing would happen. And, of course, a miracle being a shift in perception, he had to let go of his fear about not getting that which he wanted. One very cold, wintry Easter day in April, New York, Bill had promised to take an elderly woman to Easter dinner at someone's house, and he was going to be her escort, and he did it every year. Only this year, who would expect a blizzard in April? And Bill didn't drive. He didn't have a car. There was absolutely no way for him to get a taxi, and he didn't know what to do. So he did what you do in a situation like that. He sat down and he asked. And he heard the advice to get up, get dressed, wait on the street corner on Park Avenue and 71st Street. Now. And so he did that. He stood on the street corner of Park Avenue and 71st Street in a blizzard. Very few cars were out anyway, and those that were out were driving very slow and taking people someplace. And he wondered whether he was a little bit nuts at this point, when all of a sudden a huge stretch limousine stopped right near him, pulled down the window and said, "Hey, you need to go someplace?" And Bill said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "Well, I just dropped my people off and I have some spare time and you look like you're never going to get a ride." And so Bill opened the door and he thanked him, and they went to the old lady's house, and he went up into her apartment and he brought her down, and she looked at the limo and said, "Oh, my, Bill, you didn't have to go to such trouble for me." And Bill laughed, and they drove to the place where the dinner was going to be held. And Bill took the lady out of the car, and then he went back to ask the limo driver, "How much do I owe you?" And the man looked at him and said, "You don't owe me anything, buddy. It's Easter. And by the way, when are you going to leave? Maybe I can give you a lift back." Miracles are natural. When they do not occur, something has gone wrong. And, even more so, miracles arise from a miraculous state of mind, or a state of miracle readiness. Bill demonstrated that so completely, it was a lesson so thoroughly learned by me and all of those who knew him, that it's almost like breathing now when this happens, and isn't that right, of course? Bill taught in other ways, too. He didn't raise his voice. He wasn't demanding. He didn't have high expectations of me. He returned my love equally and coolly. One day, I wasn't in New York City where I lived at the time. I was in California visiting a very good friend. And we got into this terrible argument, which really meant that I screamed at him and he cried. And I yelled at him and I cussed him out. I don't even remember what he did, but whatever it was, I thought it was terrible. And he finally hid inside his room, and he locked the door, and I knew that I couldn't get at him to kill him, which, of course, is what I wanted to do. So I went to the telephone, and I called Bill Thetford back in New York City, and I was crying on the phone, and I said, "And he did this, and he did that, and then he did this and that, and now he's in his room, and I can't even get in there to kill him." It was quiet. And Bill said, "There are only 8 little words I have to say to you. Are you willing to see your brother sinless?" "No!" I screamed. "Well then, Judy, when you are, you'll feel just fine." And he hung up. You can imagine how stunned I was, and also angry. But I did it. Later, Bill reminded me of something we all know really well, and I'm sure have said many, many times. My sinless brother is my guide to peace. My sinful brother is my guide to pain, and which I choose to see, I will behold. Lesson learned for then. After I had heard their story, which had been kept secret for so long, with only a few people being cognizant of this amazing spiritual document, I asked Helen if she was aware of the source of the voice she claimed dictated the entire course to her. For me, this was an obvious question, because during my years of reading and research and teaching, I had come into contact with more than a few channels and mediums. They were old hat for me, and many of them had identified the sources of inspiration, such as Emmanuel and Seth, and Eileen Garrett, the famous medium, had her gatekeeper. I was thus very surprised to see Helen get quite pale again, and lower her eyes and look away from me. Bill laughed and grabbed her hand again and said, "Come on, Helen. If we're going to show her our document, she'll figure it out in no time. Reluctantly, Helen hissed out of the side of her mouth, "He says he's Jesus." "Well, is he?" I urged. Her reluctance vanished, and she smiled so sweetly, looked at me and said, "Of course it is." That's when I found out that both Helen and Bill were very embarrassed to be telling this story to a stranger, and especially to reveal the source. I guess I was so much less new to this than they were, and probably so much more accepting, since I didn't find anything strange at all about this story. In fact, it felt as if it were the most natural thing in the world, to be sitting there with them and hearing something that sounded so wondrous and yet so reasonable. I did ask, of course, right away to see the material, and they unlocked the filing cabinet hidden in their office and brought out 7 large black thesis binders stuffed with pages. They were professors, and they supervised many people who were getting their PhDs, and so these were the kind of binders that were very common for them to use. Bill put the first one on my lap, and I opened it up to the introduction that you all know so well. I can't say I understood it, but I intuited that this was the help I had been seeking. In fact, the help I had unknowingly begged for just a few weeks earlier when I cried out, "Won't someone up there please help me?" I asked to take the books home, and they agreed, as long as I would not show them to anyone. Of course, I concurred. One thing I wanted to know, though, and this was a puzzlement: why me? Bill explained that when they were finished with the scribing and the recopying and the editing of the course, they felt it was not for them alone. Helen asked the voice whether this sense was true, and she was told, yes, someone will come to take it on its way. Still wondering and waiting a few months later, she asked again, and this time was told, the woman who was coming is not yet ready. And finally, when Bill felt he had intuitively identified that woman as me, Helen asked the voice again, why her? And she was told that I was finally ready for my spiritual education. When they told me this, I knew it was the only answer I could accept, because it was absolutely true. Helen affirmed this with a reminder that no one is sent by accident to anyone, and Bill chimed in with, no one is where he is by accident, and chance plays no part in God's plan. I believed this, and I had the feeling that I would probably read this in the document I was now taking home, and eventually I did. But that first day with these 3 people, Helen, Bill, and Ken, my awareness began of something unfolding of which I was but a part and over which I had no control. Weeks later, when I mentioned to Bill how weird it was that I had blurted out to Helen at the table that day in the faculty dining room, "So you are hearing an inner voice," he laughed and said that's when he was sure I was the one. And then he quoted me a line from the Course, which affirmed the rightness of my outburst to Helen. You have succeeded whenever you have reached another mind and joined with it. Just what I thought, I said. So that was my new beginning, my change in life, and everything from then on became for me either before the Course or after the Course. As naturally as water flowing, we began to meet daily and talk about the Course as I studied it. Remember, they'd had it for many years, and Ken was already there 2.5 years before me, so he had thoroughly studied it. He had also been responsible in getting Helen, who was kicking and screaming, to re-edit the material to decide upon capitalization and paragraphing and chapter headings. And, of course, the way he did that was they would ask together every single thing they knew had to be done. They would ask for the Holy Spirit to guide them and give them an answer. So by the time I got there, it was already in publishable shape. I nicknamed them, without telling them in the beginning, the Holy Three. And that was because this trio seemed that way to me. We had daily gatherings at my house, and I was able to keep focused as I studied a truly remarkable document because of their help. They did rush me along a bit. I had to spend a lot of time reading and digesting. But how lucky I was to be able to ask questions of the duo who scribed the material. No one could know it better than Helen and Bill. Their subjective attitudes about this time working with me in my home differed. Helen was truculent in the beginning of a discussion. She would fuss and she would fidget and think of all sorts of other more interesting things we could be doing at the moment. Bill was attentive, ready for course conversation, but he was punning all the while. Ken had the enormous task of keeping Helen going and serving her so well that he would know when she had enough. Then he would take her home to her dinner and her husband. There were many times we spent on a one-to-one basis. Helen would play the role with me of mother and teacher. She loved me to call her Mama, and she called me Kitten. We shopped and we gossiped. We went through my wardrobe. She threw out all the clothes she didn't like. She made me go to the shoe store and get shoes just like her, which were sensible flats, but ugly as can be. She was a study in opposites. Helen was nourishing and loving to me, yet sometimes very critical and extremely demanding. I soon learned this was a very complex, intelligent, and intense lady, and what a therapist she was. Many times I witnessed how she dealt with people who had problems. They could have been people she knew. They could have been patients I heard about. They could have been people who were coming to my house to visit with them. She always was so right on. She was intuitive, insightful, and clear, and quite remarkable indeed. But then there was this other side, and I felt both protective of her and defensive from her. Bill, on the other hand, would often eat dinner with us and just play, at words, at jokes, at relaxing. There were many differences of opinions, and quite vocal between the two of them. It was clear to see that these two were not a matched pair. Yet despite past and current animosities, some recriminations, old painful history rehashed, and the opposite of forgiveness, the very great lesson I learned from spending years and years with Helen and Bill together was when it came time to explain the course, to meditate together, asking for guidance for its future. Then they were of one mind. They would reach out for each other, hold hands, and pray. And what emerged was a peacefulness, a gentleness, a purposefulness about their relationship that was stunningly beautiful to see. I wondered how to express this change to myself and others. When I finally read this sentence in the course in the next to last chapter, the will of God forever lies in those whose hands are joined. The will of God forever lies in those whose hands are joined. I knew this was what I had witnessed so many times with my beloved teachers. Helen was a bit of a hypochondriac. She knew all the things that could go wrong with the body, and she feared them. She examined each new symptom, be it a cold or stomach ache, as if it could be something much worse. Bill composed a mantra. Its rhythm and substance will be quite familiar to you long-term students of the course. Whenever Helen would worry out loud about coming down with something, Bill would chant, "I am a body, I am sickly, get me to a doctor quickly," over and over again, and finally Helen would just have to laugh. Sometimes Bill would tease Helen, misquoting some of the lyrics that they both admired. The operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan was a favorite of them both. One day Helen was complaining about the voice, which as usual was giving her really good guidance that she didn't like. Bill stood up, he did a little soft shoe routine, and he announced that he had the new theme song for the popular Broadway show, Call Me Madam. He wanted to abbreviate the name of the show, though, from Call Me Madam to Call Me Mad. And the opening song started, he said, as a duet. But he performed both his parts and Helen's because there was no way she would get involved with this. And it went something like this. I'm going to attempt something I have never done. When I was in school and the children used to sing, I was told I was a sparrow, please shut up. So I'm now going to sing to you. This is a little beginning of a play, a musical play that Bill wrote for him and Helen. Helen comes on stage. She's very distraught. She's in her office. There are the typewriters they use to type down the course, and there are all the accoutrements, the cups of coffee that they had constantly all day. And she stands and she looks at the audience and she sings. I hear voices and there's no one there. I hear voices but the room is bare. And then comes the counterpoint. So Bill would break into the song and he sang the counterpoint and it went, you sure need analyzing. It is not so surprising that you feel very mad and still. Your heart goes pitter-patter. I know just what's the matter. This voice stuff is a bitter pill. We would crack up in laughter, and we never ever heard any more of it, if there was any, because he would just make us laugh so hard. It became a running joke. Every time things got uptight, Bill would introduce a new imaginary character to this imaginary musical. But we didn't hear any more songs. He would just continue with the casting, who would play this part and who would play that part. He was funny. Often when I read the line in the course, and God's son forgot to laugh, I'd remember Bill making light of even the angst around learning the course. And once again, remember to laugh at our illusion. At one point in our relationship, we decided that it might be a good idea for us all to live together. I mean, can you believe that? That would be Helen and her husband, Louie, by the way, he wanted no part of this, Bill, Ken, my husband, Bob Skutch, and myself. So, of course, being a little nester, I started searching for the perfect place. Helen said it had to have water near it, it should be on a hill, it should be this, it should be that. Well, you can imagine what a wild goose chase I went on, and of course I never found it. And then it turned out that no one really wanted to do that anyway. They were trying to make me feel good. I was complaining. What kind of a lesson is this anyway? I spend all this time looking at properties. I go running hither and yon, and no one even wants to do this. What a waste. Grouse, grouse, grouse. Bill was reading the paper and half listening to me, and then he waited until I finished complaining. Dear, he intoned with a poker face, don't you know that heaven is your real estate? I threw a pillow at him. At one time, I was going through the end of a very nasty special relationship, and I mean nasty. Finally coming out of it on the peaceful side with much help from my therapist, Helen, I said to her, well, now I understand what that was all about. I had to learn how ugly specialness can get when one wants to try to control another person and make them be what you want them to be, when you want something from them and they don't give back. Oh, why would you need to learn that, kitten? Helen purred. Well, so I could empathize with other people who also have this experience, and since I'm going around and presenting the course, I need to know a little bit about this special relationship stuff as if I didn't have others. I said this quite smugly. Out came the claws. Nonsense, she retorted. Don't be ridiculous. The Holy Spirit teaches that sacrifice in any form is unnecessary. Was I ever quiet? Bill was often consulted by friends who asked him, how do I know if I'm making progress in this course? He always had the same gentle answer. It depends upon how long you now hold a grievance. And you know, I still do that today. Years and years since he's died, and I still think about how is my relationship with so-and-so? Am I still holding on to any grievance? If I can answer really no, I say thank you, Bill. It's a great yardstick. Toward the end of Helen's life, she did become seriously ill, and she worried about money. How could she afford the doctors and the nurses and the medicines? To try to ease her mind, I volunteered, Helen, I know you are not destitute, but if you really feel you don't have enough, I'm going to go to the bank, withdraw all my assets, and sign them over to you. Oh, kitten, she murmured, that wouldn't be enough. Okay, then, I'll ask Bob and Bill and Ken to do the same. She thought about this for a second, and then the Helen clear voice came forth. Kitten, there is no amount of money in this whole wide world that would make me feel safe. This remark has stayed with me throughout the years and has served as a powerful reminder when I get trapped in some wrong-mindedness. With Helen, the powerful teaching was usually, do as I say and not as I do. And for me, it worked. One day, when discussing the application of forgiveness, Bill came up with a catchy phrase that has served us so very well. He said, the concept of forgiveness is easy when you think of it as celestial amnesia, forgetting everything negative about someone and remembering only the positive, remembering only love. I love that. It's something I still think of today. Obviously, I could go on for days, but how do you summarize 30 years of learning? And what is the point of this reminiscing anyway? If there is anything at all that you take away from this time we spent together, it's the very ordinariness of the scribes of the Course. They were two ordinary people to whom something extraordinary happened because they joined in looking for a better way. Myths about them abound, and they are mostly just that, myths. The last thing in the world these two private folk would want is for their personas to be distorted and exalted. They would often claim, sometimes with disgust, we are not gurus of this course, we are only its first students. Our Bill was a pragmatic professor who claimed he had nothing to profess. Our Helen was a woman who had learned how to get out of the way and listen. Together, they both perfectly performed their function, and for that, we are eternally grateful. I know I am, and I have a feeling that you are too. God bless them, and love is the way we walk in gratitude.